Good morning, everyone. I said good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Welcome back, or welcome for joining us at this second Civil Society Day, but for many of you already the third or the fourth day of the Global Forum. We want to extend a special welcome to all the governments, the ambassadors, the UN agencies that were willing to join us today on their free Saturday and chose to sit with us in this room and not be out and exploring Berlin. So thank you very much. It looks a little bit like we are attending a wedding with this. I don't know whose wedding it is. And I for sure hope that you are wearing your work clothes, because today it's time to roll up our sleeves. It's really working day today. Because the GFMD was organized a little bit differently than all the prior years, today we have a nice opportunity to assess a little bit what has happened over the last days, what came out of the government days, what came out of Common Space, and how do we as civil society want to take that forward. What are we going to do? Where's the energy? Where are the possibilities? But also, what are the stumbling blocks? What's also important, I think, for us to have that moment today is that the next Global Forum is only going to be in December 2018. It's very far away from now, and we might live in a radically different world by then. But that means that we won't have this type of an informal opportunity to be together and talk how we want to organize. That means that somehow our complete focus and gear will be shifting towards a focus on the Global Compact. And that's what we've been talking about over the last days and weeks, even months. So we're going to spend a little bit of time this morning in this plenary setting just to catch up a little bit on what happened. So we'll get a report back from Gibril and from Berenice, what their impressions were from Common Space, and we'll open up the floor for you to share a little bit what you thought was most important yesterday, what you heard. But then we're going to go back into working sessions. The same 4 working sessions and 3 special sessions that we had on Thursday, for those of you who were here on Thursday. And the idea of those working sessions and really of today is twofold. As I said, it's called Commitments Day. What we want to look at is what are the actions that we take with our national governments, in regional settings, globally, to make or to advocate for a compact that we think is worth it. Are we going to write child rights like advocacy papers? Are we going to conceptualize new principles? Are we having meetings with our national government? So how are we organizing towards this global compact? And we know that we don't have a lot of time. Just to remind you, I think it's in November that the stock taking is taking place, that the big meeting in Mexico and Guadalajara is taking place. So a lot of the conceptual thinking and influencing has already been happening and needs to happen before that time. So that's one objective. What are we going to do the next few months? How we're going to organize the next year? But the other objective, and this has been said before as well, is what are the commitments, the actions, regardless of the compact? What do we want to take forward, whether this compact is going to be a success or not, because we don't know that yet. So that's what we would like you to think about when you go back into the working session and the special sessions. What needs to go into the compact, and how can we keep working on issues that we are working on anyway on the ground over the next months and year. Having that said, let's maybe start with you, just to get an impression of who we have in the room. May I ask a show of hands who has just joined us today for Civil Society Days and wasn't here on Thursday? Wow. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Then can I maybe see a show of hands of those of you who were maybe not able to go to Common Space? Wow. That's great to know, and that's quite a big group, and and we missed you yesterday, and we'll take that into account and give you a little bit of a thorough update on what transpired yesterday. Can I see a show of hands who is hopeful that this global compact is going to be a big success? Hopeful. If I wait a little bit longer, I think all hands will be up. And who's skeptical? Okay, I think this is about a 60-40% division. So let's see where we are. We'll ask the question again at the end of the day and see where we are now, where we are then. So just a little bit about yesterday. I provided an updated speech to the governments on what we concluded on the first day of our civil society days. And we laid out a sort of a 10-point, for the 10th anniversary, we laid out a 10-point priority plan that we wanted to put to governments and wanted them to take into account. We're not going to reiterate those 10 points. I think the speech is on most of the tables, but perhaps more importantly, we are going to send it around this morning to all of you and maybe even to a bigger mailing list. But not only are we sending around the speech, because we know very well that a speech or a statement like this never captures the richness and the thoroughness of the discussions that you've actually had. So what we will do this morning is we'll send around the speech to everyone, but also the detailed reporting templates of each of the working sessions, each of the special sessions, and of all of the common space sessions, so that you have a bit more of a detailed idea for the themes you're interested in, what was discussed. So in a moment I'm going to invite Gibril to give us a little bit of a sense of where he feels the energy is around the Global Compact and what was concluded in common space. I think one thing we already concluded on our first day is that it seems there's still a lot of confusion about this Global Compact for migration, about the format, the scope, whether it will be binding or not, although it seems that there's quite some movements towards a non-binding document. And we've also concluded that creates a great opportunity for us to maybe still have some impact on what will be the scope and the format of the Global Compact. What I want to do first, before we go into assessing what transpired as a common space, is to make true on a promise that we made. Some of us this morning were up quite early. I saw some of you went for a run in sports clothes. Some of us went to the Brandenburger Gate to wave goodbye to one of the leaders of our packer, Ignacio Packer, who's been a great leader and worked with many of us, particularly in pushing for the child rights agenda and children's rights. He ended his mandate at Terre des Hommes, and he's now on a tour on bike and kayak and running to raise awareness around child rights issues for children in movement. And what we promised him that we would do this morning is show the video that was made from the Children on the Move conference that took place in Berlin a couple of weeks back. So we're going to start with that, and then we're going to open up our plenary.
First priority should be to treat children as children and not as undocumented migrants or overstayers or anything else. First, children are children. This means that children should go to school, whatever the situation they are in. Within days, let's say a week, they need to be registered for school. They need to have the proper health care.
We want to ask decision makers why we cannot study immediately. Why we want to wait? We have to wait 1.5 years to get a permission.
Too many children at the moment are being detained just because they are considered irregular migrants. This is terrible solution for children. We hear it from them. We know it from this research.
I can talk about my detention experience easily today, and most of the times I do get emotional about it. For some reason, the thoughts and the memories come to my mind and I start crying, and all of a sudden I can't stop crying because of something that happened to me about 7 years ago.
Even more, children have the right to participation. They have the right to be heard, and they have something to say. So listen to them, and this is something world leaders will need to understand as much as parents and other duty bearers at schools, at authorities. Listen to them, understand what they want, what their destination is, what their future is, and help them develop.
Children with a migration background or refugees should have the access to get a high qualified education in their country. Don't depends where you live. It could be possible everywhere.
A child is a child is a child. So whoever, wherever, should have access to the same services, education, social services, health. This is the way that we will build a society, a peaceful society, a harmonious society.
And as I think you all have seen, many of the people and the youth featured in the video are here with us today. This Children on the Move conference is really, and the whole organizing around it was really an extraordinary exercise of linking different civil society groups with UN agencies, with states, and involving the people that we're talking about, in this case, children and youth. I think Ignacio always says we should put aside our logos and our egos, and it's about the messages that we want to bring. So let us take that forward in this common space, and thank you very much to all the youth and all the organizations that were involved for being with us here today. So I will turn to Gibril now to give us a bit of a layout on what transpired in common space and what we can take forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Wies. The schedule yesterday at Common Space were the usual opening and closing sessions, the plenary ones, which the opening session, of course, we had the report from Wies as chair. But I would focus not on the opening and closing, but on the sort of workshops, as it were. There were the 3 framing workshops and the 7 focused workshops. As part of the closing sessions, we were able to give feedback about the framing sessions. But today, I'll give you a little bit more information about some of the specific discussions in the focused workshops. There were 7 of them. I would also tell you that the reports I've got, we had a very neat reporting template for all of the workshops. Those would be available to you by email at some point today. And the template asked the questions for participants to identify, depending on the topic, good practices that they already know about. And you would be impressed to see the list of good practices on every topic undertaken by government, civil society, and other stakeholders. The second question was to identify what civil society, governments, and other stakeholders can do in relation to the compact, topics, and specific ideas and suggestions were made. And finally, people were asked, the rapporteurs were asked to give a sort of one-point highlight. So I would quickly go through some of the highlights, as it were. On the first one, on Children on the Move, that one, because as you've seen with the video, there's also a document that's already available, whereby on this topic, goals, targets, and indicators have already been suggested. But amongst the things that caught my eye in terms of the global compact and what can be in there is the idea of moving towards having standards on best interest determination. Absolute, definitely no detention of children, but perhaps put a deadline of 2023 and no family separation. In my own mind now, I'm beginning to look at the template that we've used yesterday and today and see how we should, this is my personal view, how we should merge that template today in our thinking towards the possible template of the compact. Because these are our views, our template, but we want it to be in the compact. So I think we should have in mind what that compact may look like. On the first day and yesterday, I shared with you at least some of the points I think, or the chapters of the compact. So in my own thinking, whilst reading the feedback, I've been thinking about those points along those lines. So take on the children the idea of no detention. So that to me would be under an imagined heading under the compact under omissions. So no detention to children, it would sit there. On the second workshop, that was on vulnerable situations, there was a general statement made that migrants by themselves are not vulnerable. It's about precariousness. And everything that's been done, it's about preventing and then mitigating precarious situations. Some examples and issues mentioned were humanitarian corridors, the determination of having clear view on how to determine climate change migrant, to have a sort of status for climate-induced migration, and also the creation of safe points as different from safe corridors. Safe corridors, it's a route, safe point is a specific place. Coming back to think about the template of, or a possible template for the compact, both on the first day, civil society and common space, I was suggesting that we should not be repeating principles. We should talk about the new principles. Yes, we should talk about the principles, but now reading all of the feedback and all the templates, I have this slight feeling that I'm going to fail on this, that I cannot stop repetition. So, but I think we can mitigate it and perhaps suggest having a chapter on commitments or principles that are worth repeating, so that we don't repeat everything, but ones that we need to stress, so that we pick out from our thinking some we need to stress, but also set out a chapter on the ones that are new. On the third working group, which was on xenophobia, some of the suggestions were encouraging and developing migrant role models so that they speak for themselves and be able to show that they are part of society. The suggestion that that the most important tool would be early education and awareness raising. That is not to bring racism and xenophobia, to fight it at the earliest stage in primary schools, nursery, at that level. There was the point stressed in a strong way about working at municipal and local level, that it's at community municipal level that perhaps the biggest impact would be have, and for civil society and government to work concretely together in terms of changing the narrative of migrants and refugees, and that mainly that is around getting not only facts about migration, but also the history and dates of migration in particular countries. On the third group, on return and reintegration, there's definitely a very strong point about regularization, that it must be on the agenda. I have the sense that it has to be. So if the point I was making yesterday about the degree of heat and warmth, this is one bit where I think there seems to be such a strong view that if we need to give a bit of heat to member states, so be it, because regularization should be a new principle that's adopted. Then the debate can be about time period, but not concept. Social integration programs, civic engagement and social entrepreneurship, all as methods of enhancing integration, reintegration, and return. One point perhaps need to be flagged up a bit more is really about health and socio-psychology of returnees and the mental health of returnees. I understand it's a growing problem in many parts, so somehow this needs to be reflected. The role of consular and embassies, or consular services and embassies, and perhaps developing a bit more and already introducing in the Global Compact the phrase of diaspora diplomacy, because there are also countries like Philippines that do that quite well right now. There's the concept of, in terms of omissions, would be not to reduce or deplete the legal representation that migrants have, because we're also seeing a tendency where migrants, they still have they might have access, theoretically access to the law, but because resources are being cut back, in practice they don't have access to the law. And in some countries, that's actually a deliberate policy, whereby, in effect, you're denied access. And the overriding phrase, overriding goal, was that return must not only be voluntary, but need to be dignified. On section Workstream 5, which was about labor mobility and regularization, there was the point of recognizing, setting up skills alliance, and the idea of skills passporting. And again, there's case studies of that being done. You can, just as your identity is represented by your passport, your skills are recognized in that passport type, which you can carry from country to country. Amongst the omissions, I don't know how strong it is, but because I didn't see a date there, but it would be that the kafala system should be ended. So it's in there. So I don't know whether what dates are put in, but it seemed to be a strong suggestion. Engagement with employers and unions and other stakeholders, and that for labor migration, it is more important than other sectors to take a full migration cycle, including a reflection of circularity. The sixth focus session was on recruitment and migrant workers. And this is an area where there are existing conventions. And the point was really practical programs and practical commitments on how to translate these conventions and these agreements and some of the ILO conventions into practice. Regulation of recruitment agencies and having a regime to stamp down on unethical practices in a form of robust monitoring and regulation. Then the seventh focus group was complementary pathways, both for refugees and migrants. The sense was that this is urgent. This is something quick needs to be done, and that in the same framework, family reunion should be strongly on the agenda or in the compact, that should be allowed. And the concept of allowing migrants to have the ability to vary their status, some flexibility of varying their status in a way that fosters their integration in their new countries of residence. So those were the points that I picked out from the 7 reports. As I said, you would have that yourselves. My comment, co-chairs, would be, if it makes sense, that in our work groups this afternoon, or this morning and this afternoon, really we see how we try to place them within the headings of the compact. On the bits on the case studies, I think that is a wealth of information for our advocacy. So virtually everything we want, there is some country that is doing it. somehow. So that's the wealth of advocacy. And in practice, our starting point might be on that topic. We might even see whether those countries and the leaders of those case studies can be our champions in the ongoing consultations and negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Gibril. And that's, of course, an invitation to the group as well to take those points and see where we can fit them in the compact and to the moderators of the working sessions. Before we turn to Berenice, I just want to say a big thank you to all the rapporteurs, both of the common space sessions as well as of the working sessions. I know the timelines that we give you are always impossible, so it's quite impressive that you're able to provide us with reports with such detail. And also thanks for those that made the reporting templates, because they're really useful to use.
And they managed to get it in within minutes of closing. I must say that yesterday. So thank you very much. I'm most grateful.
But Berenice, if we can turn to you for your impressions.
Ok, como ya saben, voy a hablar en español. Bueno, yo solo quisiera comentarles.
First of all,
que,
I'd like to mention
pues no
that,
pretendo hacer
well, I don't want to summarize everything that we discussed yesterday, but it's important to exchange impressions. And more important even is, in my view, to see how are we going to articulate all those arguments. Because going beyond the global compact, there are many threats and many challenges we'll have to face as civil society and working together with the other actors. So how are we going to make use of this momentum we have at the Global Pact to articulate all these arguments? Whether we think that the Global Pact will be an instrument which will bring change. What opportunities do we have as civil society and also in the different regions to push through what we want to achieve? There are things that are non-negotiable, but it's not just about positioning ourselves. It's also about the different processes. How are we going to involve our bases? How are we going to get the immigrants on board? How do we get our voice, the voice from the different regions, heard? Because there's a very global dialogue. They're big ideals, but within that ideal framework, we are not reaching the basic human rights standards. So I would invite all of you to think about how are we going to articulate all these ideas? How are we going to make use of the Global Pact, whether we trust the instrument or not, whether we think, whether we want it to be binding or not. Some people in the common spaces yesterday were saying this is not going to be binding, and if it's binding, there's not going to be consensus among the governments.
So how can we make use of this moment where the views of the different governments and the UN are focused on migration and mobility in order to push through the things that we want? We have the strength and we can articulate ourselves. Besides, we're going to work more and more from the grassroots, from the regions. I would like to hear more from the Middle East. We haven't heard much from them. Asia and Africa as well. What do we want to push through? The Mexican government said this is not the moment to negotiate. But the present is exactly the moment where we have to negotiate. We are not going to negotiate when everything has been agreed. How can we push that from our countries and our regions? What other strategies could we develop beyond the timelines for the regional consultations, which are really important? This is a process that we haven't seen before with other instruments. But what else can we do? Can we articulate from our regions before Mexico? We hope that you can come to Mexico in December so that we can keep on working. You can count with the help of the Mexican civil society. And what are we going to do from now until then? That would be one point. The other point would be co-responsibility. It is really important for me, but I think that we have to. Well, we cannot speak about co-responsibility as if we have the same conditions as governments and the private initiatives. Governments have a mandate, a democratic mandate. They have to obey the people. They have the resources and they have the state apparatus. They cannot demand the same level of co-responsibility from us. This is something that we have to make clear at a global level. This is not only about good practices, because isolated best practices cannot amount to much. We need to see what we need to focus on in order to bring change on the field with migrants. And I would also like to talk about private initiative. The private initiative is the civil society, and the level of dialogue that they have is different to ours. We could see that in the common spaces. They have a different approach. We are not on the same level of power. When we talk about gender, we talk about the different levels of power that we have. We need to be aware of this, especially in terms of migration and culturality. And from that base, we need to develop our strategies. We cannot take for granted that we are at the same level as governments and that we are going to act accordingly as if we had the same base conditions. It is good to have young people among us. We need to train new leaders. We need to have a correlation between generations. We need to be self-critical and see what we request from governments and what do we want to replicate or what we are replicating and the things that we should change as well. Here we have people that are committed, fully committed, and we need to achieve something. We shouldn't leave everything on the hands of the government. But what can we do? What could we start doing? I would like to end by speaking about co-responsibility, and I would like to pay homage to a person who died in Mexico yesterday. He worked in the field of human rights. He was in Mexico. He came from Guatemala. He suffered a lot, and he was the right hand of the Padre Alejandro Solalinde in Oaxaca. He was helping migrants in transition. He was threatened many times, but he died in an accident. That was yesterday. This is something hurtful for the whole region. And I would like to pay a tribute to him with a minute of silence. We put a lot of love and effort in order to fight for migrants, and I would like to request a minute of silence for him.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.
Thank you, Bera, and thank you for sharing this. And we're very that's the timer. We're very sorry for your loss, for everyone's loss. It reminds us also of how personal this work is, and let's carry his spirit with us today. That brings us to opening up the floor to you. Maybe just to add to what Gibril and Bera already shared, for me, having been in quite a few common spaces like many of you, yesterday was really one of the most focused and constructive common spaces that I've ever seen, with a lot of real debate and real practices. And we asked this question about being hopeful or being skeptical, but it's been quite extraordinary, I find, that there are so many states willing to share practices on themes that weren't discussed years ago. We didn't speak about regularization. There were certain Western states that spoke about the firewalls that they have for undocumented migrant workers and their service providers, willing to put this on the record. So there is at least some hope in that. And I want to thank everyone, and particularly the steering committee, for thinking about this format of common space. I think we can take that forward. So we're going to open up the floor to ask you to share your reflections on what transpired yesterday that we need to take forward. I mean, that's the focus. What do we build on? And I'd like to address 3 specific groups in the audience if you have any questions or remarks. So first of all, the people who could not be with us in common space yesterday. Are there any specific questions or worries that you would like to see answers for by the people that were there? So that's for the people that weren't there. For the people that were there, is there anything, do you agree with the observations of Gibril and better what the main point was? And is there anything that everyone needs to know before they go into working sessions? And then thirdly, we're quite privileged that there are a couple of governments in the room that have been involved with the Global Forum for a very long time. We're also at Common Space, so if they would be willing to share some of their reflections that they think are important for civil society to know, that'd be great. I know we have the Philippines in the room and Switzerland. I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but you're warmly invited to join for this. Oh, and of course we have Germany in the room as well, and maybe some other governments that I haven't seen yet. So the floor is open. Could we start here? Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Ariel Tiny from the Detention Forum in the UK. I was actually one of the co-moderators of the returns and reintegration session on the first day, and also at the Common Day yesterday. And thank you for a very precise and also concise summary. I just wanted to raise one thing, I think, which was actually not well expressed, but quite dominant in our session, which is a concern with regards to forced return. Yes, there was a lot of conversation about what return is, how it should be dignified, and it should be a consented return. However, I think there was a lot of concern around human rights violation, which does take place in the context of forced return, particularly the use of detention. I'm very pleased to see that there seems to be consensus on that no child should be detained. That's really great. Let's not forget that the other people also detained for a long time. And I think without addressing the issue, we can't really talk about safety in migration. So I just want to raise that issue here very clearly to have it noted, but also want to know if there is going to be further opportunity to articulate those additional things later in the course of today. Thank you.
Thank you. If we could have someone who was not at Common Space, are there any questions? The lady in pink or purple here. And then...
From the report, I heard that the responses from the Middle East was very little. So I am concerned. One, the presence of the governments from the Middle East, why there is a silence. I come from India, and there are the situations of migrant workers being quite concerned about these issues. Secondly, how do we ensure the CSO's participation or promote CSOs from the Middle East so that there could be a voice raised by the CSOs? So if the government do not respond, at least there could be CSOs who could be part of it. There could be a greater participation of the CSOs, and they could, in fact, bring in these voices and then maybe make the government to respond, or at least in their own spaces. So that is one concern. And also, yesterday from some of the reports we heard that there was a clubbing of the vulnerability, children and women and some other situations put together, wherein you don't have sufficient space for really articulating what are the vulnerabilities and situations, so how that can be also solved. Thank you.
Thank you. Just following up on that, is there perhaps someone from the NGOs of the Middle East that would like to reflect on that point? Linda.
Good morning. Maybe usually we didn't find enough governmental representative and GFMD from Middle East. Maybe last year and this year be more than years before. But I think this is a big problem regarding to migrants in the Middle East and Middle East as country of destinations, and other country as country of origin for the migrants. There is, I think, no real negotiation between both of them, and I think the interests in the countries of destination different of the countries of origin. So it's very important to find solution. I found that always we hear the same notes. Always we hear the same recommendations. But what will happen after these recommendations? Who will follow these recommendations? Who will ask the government to implement this recommendation? This is the problem. The international process till now not do anything regarding to this. I'm not talking about GFMD, not only GFMD, but also I'm talking about international mechanism like UBR and shadow reports. And for example, for our countries, we submit many shadow reports in all the conventions and UBR, but till now we didn't find enough response by the governments regarding to this. Thank you.
Can I maybe invite a similar question for representatives from civil society that might be here from Africa, because we heard that there's been some little, yeah, all the way at the back.
Thank you. I'm also a little bit concerned about follow-up, even if the compact is going to come into place. And I think the one question we always struggle with, especially in countries like South Africa when we go back, is who is going to hold the state accountable for its actions, even though it might be a non-binding commitment. But I'm also a little bit curious about the role of the IOM and how it's sort of, I don't know if we call it a streamlining into the United Nations, and what its role in the compact would be. Would it be about monitoring, evaluation, and producing some kinds of reports that could sort of speak to the compact? So I think maybe some clarity there if there's such a response, or if we need to also think about that as a possible way to, because some of us do partner with IOM in the local, in the national level, and it could be one way, for example, to try to get information on how these principles are being implemented, or at least being monitored. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's the right question to ask, and I think partly it's also on us to answer this, because no one knows this yet. So it would be great to get some reflections on this, but what we think the role of IOM or any of the other UN agencies can be. Are there any UN agencies in the room that would like to put some reflection? Bela, at the back. Yeah.
This is on monitoring and follow-up, right? Well, I personally believe that civil society is always doing a fantastic job in holding member states accountable. That's very important. One possibility is that we look, the New York Declaration, for example, has some ideas about follow-up and implementation. Questions are whether when it comes to the international organizations, whether it should be closely associated with the follow-up of the Agenda 2030, meaning the high-level political forum, whether there should be something separately, whether it should be attached to another opportunity that you have is the periodic high-level dialogues on international migration. That is, of course, a dedicated migration event in the General Assembly, taking place moments. I think, what is it, a 4-year cycle? So, if I remember well. So that could be an opportunity to for review at the UN. But if you look at review and implementation chapters, and I really recommend that you look at other outcomes of other important UN conferences in the past. And there are lots of ideas there, how that can be, how that's happening, what's the national action, what's the regional action, what's the global action. And I, coming from a population perspective, I always look at the Program of Action of ICPD 1994, where there's a big chapter on review and implementation at all different levels. It also talks about capacity building. There are lots of ideas there, I think, that you can borrow from and apply. Of course, the GFMD itself doesn't have a kind of a review mechanism. It's kind of informal dialogue and cooperation. It has never been something for implementation and accountability. I think that is, now that may change or not, whatever member states want to have. But that's what I can come up with, at least with regard to the General Assembly.
Thank you very much. And maybe I should have asked you when you speak, if you could introduce yourself. This is Vela Hovi from the UN Secretariat, from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Population Division. Are there any member states that would like to share some reflections? Switzerland at the back.
Thank you very much. Pietro Mona from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Well, you said it's a privilege to have governments in the room. It's actually the other way around. It's our privilege to be here. I think one aspect that I thought was quite striking of the common space and of the GFMD this year is really that it seems there are no more topics that are off limits for our discussions. And that, I think, is a sign of maturity of the Global Forum. I know that there are many topics where governments and civil society don't agree upon, including, for example, on certain aspects of return. But the fact that we started a dialogue on that, I think, is something that I would sort of take, for me, as one of the key principles, that we use this platform to discuss these issues, knowing that it's going to be tough, knowing that this is a hard discussion, but the fact that we can talk about it, I think, is something very important and something that we have to keep both in view of the Global Compact, but then also in future GFMDs really at the heart of our agendas. I think another aspect that sort of I felt yesterday was also a bit this tension between long-term visions in the Global Compact and the urgency on the ground. And this is something that also came up at the last year's summit with the New York Declaration, where also from civil society, a lot of voices came up and say, well, governments have sort of taken sort of a back exit out of their responsibility, saying, we now have the New York Declaration, but actually we will start talking now with the Global Compact. So it was perceived by a lot of the civil society organizations as a bit of a way out of taking up the responsibility that is urgent on the ground at the moment. So I think this is also something that I felt, at least in those discussions that I was part of yesterday, certainly coming from the civil society of saying yes to the Global Compact, very much so. It's an extremely important opportunity, but don't forget to governments, don't forget your responsibilities now. Governments have made commitments, both in the New York Declaration, both in the high-level dialogue, and in the 2030 agenda. So we don't have to wait until the Global Compact comes out. I think this is also something that I certainly take with me. And the last point really is and this is why I was very much looking forward to be part of today's discussion, is sort of the dynamic that I felt within the civil society to be engaged in discussions, to be part of the Global Compact process. I know there are a lot of questions also, at least from the discussions I had, of how exactly the civil society can be part of the process, where can they interact, and this is just, again, sort of coming back on what you mentioned at the beginning of Ignacio and his work together with colleagues from Save the Children, many others. I mention it regularly, but I think if you really, from my personal point of view, if you want to see an excellent example of how civil society can interact, look at what they have done on children's rights. I think this is an excellent example. And I know there are many more in this room that are working on similar initiatives, and it's just now a question of bringing them forward, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussions to you today, so to see also what else is there so that we can join forces and bring that together forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And we're glad that one message that we all seem to agree on, namely that implementation doesn't have to and cannot wait, came across, and I hope we can work on that. We'll take one more point here.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Laura Gonzales Murphy. I am representing sort of a government, not the US right now, although that might be a good thing itself, but I am representing the state of New York as a regional government. I am the director of Governor Cuomo's Office for New Americans, and I wanted to emphasize for us, the way we deliver our services are through civil society organizations. The way we help immigrants under the directive of the government, which is right now to us to provide assistance in many different ways to all immigrants in New York State, irrespective of documentation, is something that obviously, as you all know, goes against what we're facing at the national level. But I must emphasize one of the things that I heard this morning by Mr. Faal, that is one of the key points I think that you're including in that compact, and it's for us to deliver our services, we need the consulates. I wanted to emphasize that very much because right now, in the environment that we're facing, often when I'm trying to assist an immigrant through our civil society organizations, that consulate is key. We need documentations from them. We need birth certificates. We need statements that help us identify that individual. And often I find there are some consulates that are, right there, but others that are very difficult to access. So I think that emphasizing that role and that responsibility on the regional level right now for what the situation we're going through in New York, in the US in general, I wanted to say thank you for including that. It's very important. And again, to emphasize the role of regional governments within the US, because I know not the whole country is having that perspective. New York, California, Michigan, Massachusetts, we have programs that we're trying to do in the defense of the migrant. So thank you for that opportunity to say that.
And thank you very much for joining us. I should have recognized this morning. We do have some local authorities and regional authorities also in the room, and it's actually great that we can have all of that in one room and expand our dialogue. We have about 50 minutes left in this plenary until we go to a working session. So we'll take a couple of more points and then invite some final reflections from Gibril and Bede. The gentleman all the way at the back.
Hello, my name is David Mohney Nabti from Lebanon with civil society and private sector. And we as well have a lot of concerns about the limited participation from the Middle East. And we are very interested in working from our side, on the non-governmental side, and working with partners, organizations, and governments from around the region and around the world to be more active in that, both from the regional perspective and in Lebanon. We have a very critical situation. We have the highest proportion of refugees of any country in the world, and a lot of dire conditions that relate to that, some of them inside the country and some of them that relate to how countries around the world are relating to the refugees and to Lebanon. But one of my other main concerns about the forum of the last couple days is it seems that much of these discussions are happening separate from the massive shifts of technology and macroeconomics that are happening in the world. And some of these issues related to self-driving cars and artificial intelligence and virtual reality, advanced robotics, et cetera, are already, they exist. They're no longer futuristic, and they are going to have a massive impact. They're going to have a massive impact on our world, on employment, on migration, and there's been so little discussion on those issues, and I'm very concerned about that potentially, at least from my very limited perspective thus far, lack of preparation for that, and how it seems like the policymaking process is happening at a pace massively slower than the pace of technology shifts in the world. There's both room for I think leveraging some of those technology shifts for positive opportunities as well. If we don't prepare for them, it's going to be very painful. But I think we can also learn a lot from those spaces in the entrepreneurship and innovation technology spaces and apply them to the technology realm to really advance a lot of opportunities and defend against a lot of the potential pains. So I don't know how we can maybe try to bring more of those conversations into the process, but I think it could be very helpful.
Thank you very much, and I'd encourage you also to bring that into one of the working sessions on specific themes and how we can leverage that. Mr. Bingham.
Thanks very much, Ms. Maas. I'm very happy actually to follow the last speaker talking about robots. I feel like a robot. And as massively slower paces go, I'm going to apologize for mine. But I also wanted to attach to Kuda's question before about IOM, and as we move into this year of further thinking and expressing civil society voice on the compact, and then into negotiation, which we are very much a part of in civil society. Let's be clear, whatever anyone might suggest that we're not in the negotiation room or we're not formally part of negotiations in the UN system, we're very much a part of negotiations during that period with governments in the hallways, in their own offices. Some of the governments come to civil society for conversation as they work in the more formal process of negotiation. So our real work, or our next phase of work, actually starts in the negotiation process. But on IOM, if we're really talking about a global compact on migration, and we really want that compact to have action now for safe, orderly, and regular migration, we very much as civil society have to think about not only IOM, but the new IOM now that it's part of the UN system. So I think that's exactly the right question. I don't think we've done enough thinking on that. Even before the summit, when IOM was walking into the UN system, I don't think we had done enough thinking as civil society. I don't think we had voiced enough of our sense of what that should mean. But now that IOM is in the UN system and the UN system is walking its way into a migration compact, what should the new IOM look like? Should we as civil society insist on a protection orientation, a protection mandate, a UN-type protection focus, formalized? Formalized. And what does that mean? I don't know. I don't know if we do. But we've got some time, not much, to think about it. So I think, Kuda, that was the right question. Thank you, Ms. Maas.
Yeah, thank you for putting the protection mandate of IOM on the table. I think we can spend another couple of days meeting on that. We're going to take 2 more points, and if I could maybe invite someone of the youth representatives also in the room to provide their reflections. So the gentleman right here.
Alors moi je suis de la plateforme euro-marocaine.
I'm from the Euro-Moroccan platform. I have a question because I'd like to understand. I hope it's not just a translation problem. We talk about xenophobia a lot, and we know that xenophobia, you need awareness campaigns, etc., and the work that's done to live together, cohesion. But for us, what's extremely important, discrimination, racism. It's the responsibility of the states that is vis-à-vis these 2 questions, discrimination and racism. Those are the 2 main themes. We need to include these 2 elements in Compact because there are so many racist movements in power and a lot of movements with a lot of discrimination, and that's what triggers suffering because we are in the field and there's a lot of harm caused. We need commitments on behalf of the states today in order to have the necessary legislations to fight discrimination and racism. Gafala is part of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So any of the youth representative to wrap up this part of our program?
Hi, I'm Marianne, as you probably know. I'm a youth delegate for the campaign to end immigration detention of children. And this is my first GFMD participation, and I really want to thank all of you for having made this happen, for having our youth delegates here and our youth representation here. And this is really important because we have stories to tell, we have experience to share, and we can tell from our personal stories and experience what really have to be passed as new law and new legislation for migrants and refugees, but in this case, migrants especially. And I'm really glad that you brought us all here, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I really have to thank you all and appreciate it. I also want to say thank you to the Swiss government for sending a representative here today. Yesterday I was doing a side event, and the Swiss government representative Pietro was there, and I really hope that he didn't take it personal. I was making criticism about how government representatives weren't engaging so much in the discussions we were having during the common space yesterday. I don't know what happened in the other sessions, but I was in the child rights session, and I really wish there were more government representatives there and giving a voice and telling civil society what they were standing for, what their ideas were, and what they were expecting to pass as law or not, and insert it in the global compacts. So I really do hope that I will get the chance to come next year again and be part of it all and be able to cooperate with migrants, especially children on the move, as I am so engaged in this cause. And I really do hope that I see government representatives speak out more, and I hope that we can all be here next year and being grateful for the great work that we know governments are capable of doing for the benefit of all migrants. So thank you again.
And thank you for being such an inspiration. We're going to turn back to the panel, but I think, Colin, I will make one exception. You might have some really practical advice for us while we go into the working session. So you'll have the final word from the floor.
Thanks. I'm not very practical, so I'm sorry about that. No, but I think this, some of the points raised here were really spot on. I think I think we're at a really, I mentioned this on the opening on Thursday. I'm sorry if I keep repeating this, but I think we're at a momentous paradigm shift. And sometimes when we're at a moment where the shift happens, we don't recognize it till much later, much after that. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of recognizing it later because we'll be left out of the game. So I think this is a great opportunity we have here now to start really entrenching ourselves into what we'd like to see. Because I think, as Ambassador Pietro mentioned, nobody really knows yet what it really looks like. I think from the experience so far, what we've been listening to governments talking about it in the thematic sessions around the Global Compact, it's not really clear. Everybody's still sort of like vultures hovering yet, and nobody's landed on the Global Compact carcass. Wrong analogy to use. No, I told you I'm not very practical. But I think this is the point. We have to really seize the moment now to try to figure out what we'd like to see. I can't speak for IOM. I think Michelle Klein-Solomon from IOM will be joining us later. We can repost the question to her about IOM's role. But I think John's right. We can help to define what IOM's role is in the compact and what IOM's role is with civil society. I think we can engage. I think we have to engage and hold them accountable as well, just as we do with states. I think we also have to go beyond. This is the point. We don't say, we don't make our demands yet. We want to hold accountable, but we also want to put forward our cooperation and our strong recommendations. We know, and you know, we want to take at face value what states have been saying a lot. that yes, stakeholders are important, civil society are important, we value you. We want to hold them to that. So the way we hold them to that is we put forward our recommendations, our inputs, and where we want to cooperate in the implementation and follow-up. I'm really glad to hear that we're talking about follow-up already, because I think it's really good that we think about this in a long-term vision. What we can accomplish now, and I think a lot of people are looking at a greater timeline, but what we can accomplish now, but also what's the vision down the line, and how we can contribute, how we have to play a very significant part of that. We keep talking about how we reflect so much of the reality of what happens on the ground. We are also going to be the recipients as migrants, communities, and organizations working with migrants. We are the ones that are going to experience what comes out from the compact, for better or for worse. So let's work towards the better together and put our best foot forward now, before it gets too late and we find we're left out and just complaining on the sidelines, because we won't be able to affect anything and we'll be experiencing it. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Colin, and that's a perfect assignment as we go into the working sessions to work on that. So if I could invite Gibril and Barry, if you, adding to what Colin just said, have any sort of final advice to the group before we go into the working sessions and try to work on some of the concrete questions that we've asked.
Thank you, Wies. I think it's useful to always remind ourselves sort of why in civil society we have this energy. It's because of our absolute impatience and outrage of injustice in the world. But we have to temper that by remembering what we achieve. You see, in this topic, we have, in my view, part of our successes is being able to put, as Pietro said, many of the topics that once were not on the table are on the table. I think we've made a significant progress on that. What I'm hearing and what I'm also feeling is that we think that we need to achieve lots more on implementation. And that's the point people are making, that even when you have very formal review methodologies like the UPR and all of that, still people are feeling that there's a gap between what we say, what member states say, and what we do. This is the reason why I've been concentrating about format on how this compact should look like. And I'll just take time to come back to this point about having a whole section on omissions. One of the reasons why monitoring and reviews fail is because of ambiguity. If there's ambiguity in we don't know for sure whether someone is doing something or not doing something or is blurred, then it's difficult to make concrete points. And the whole approach about omissions, I'm borrowing that from the legal profession. The legal profession, the way we go around that, because you have to be, in the legal profession, in some areas, you have to be able to know who to blame. And there shouldn't be any ambiguity about it. That's why in some contracts, you have acts and omissions separated. That way, it is very clear where you sit. Now, I'm not suggesting that for the compact, this approach should be taken as a form of blaming. But I think it is important to use this context so that we know where member state civil society sit. Even me, the civil society organization I'm involved in, I would want a methodology where at the end of the day, I'm assessing myself and saying, seeing these things, I'm not doing it, so I belong to this camp. Not in a blaming manner, but then I can address the reasons why I sit on this camp. So clarity of what we should do and we must not do is important. Second, that leads me to the point of review and evaluation and robust monitoring of this process. That debate has to be had now. We have methods, and Bella's mentioned linkage perhaps to the high-level sort of forum as one mechanism, but I think also perhaps the global forum itself, not only the high-level dialogues, but the global forum itself may have a role in that, whereby if we have the methodology of monitoring, especially in a way whereby it's not a blaming method, but an encouraging method, the Global Forum can be a methodology for it. In civil law, there's a concept that he who introduces ambiguity suffers for it. So anybody who's using language to make things confusing should suffer for it. So then we assume that they have something to hide. So this is why I think we should concentrate a bit more on the methodology. So that's my main observation. The only last thing is, we've heard, I'm grateful to hear many comments, and as I said, in the reports, there are lots more that I've given back. If possible, perhaps with the help of ICMC, with civil society, I think it would be useful to not only publish it, but spend some time going through all of them, including what we collect today, and then reorganizing it in the anticipated chapters of the compact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gibril. Last year, we learned from the Irish ambassador who was doing the negotiations that there is a concept called constructive ambiguity. I don't know if that's true, but it's something to think about. Before we give Bere the final word of this panel, I just want to recognize the ambassador of the Philippines who is with us in the room. And going back to Mariana's point, it's great that we can have this shared space and shared dialogue. So just want to give you the opportunity, Mr. Voss, to share a few of your observations.
Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. That means good morning, everybody. I'm not the ambassador of the Philippines. I'm just Rico Voss from the Philippine Mission in Geneva. Two short and very brief things that we wanted to share. One is that from our perspective, we must all be reminded that we have, at this point of time, have a lot of things in common. That we must not forget that. We have a lot of things in common in terms of concepts on detention, concepts on returns, concepts that we must work on and build on it as we go on the Global Compact, rather than emphasize our differences, rather than emphasize where we depart. We should emphasize between the governments, the NGOs, and the CSOs, our commonalities so that we could move forward. That's one thing that we wanted to share and we wanted to deliver in this forum. The second one is that, please, this is an appeal, engage your governments. The modalities resolution for doing the compact is already done, and it's primarily a government negotiation process. Unless you engage your governments as our NGOs in the Philippines are engaging our government, your voices may not be that heard. So, two things, practical things that we wanted to share in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Bere, the floor is yours.
Bueno, solo decirles que a los gobiernos que están
that to all governments here present, I hope that they will be able to bring over our proposals, recommendations to all other governments which are not here present, so that they bear us in mind in the other processes, regardless on whether we are acting part in their governments or not. But it'd be great if they invited us to the different processes in the course of all these negotiations. To the international organizations, I'd like to say the following. Could you raise your hand, all those that come from international organizations such as the IOM or UN here present? There's not anybody. Yes? Could you raise your hand to those here present representing IOM or international organizations? Thank you very much for being here. And also, I'd like to say, bring this over, if you could bring this over to the different UN agencies and different representations, the work carried out by civil society, because the United Nations governments should really listen to all the dialogues that are taking place. And the third group is civil society. Since we are all united. Sometimes you don't have to go in person. You can take advantage of this, and we could bring something over. We could articulate the ideas. We could use the momentum of the Global Compact so that we can put on the table all those things we want to be on the table. We shouldn't wait for the government to tell us what do they want. We can take advantage and start by saying to them, this is what we want on the Global Compact, and this is what we need to work on. Thank you.
So that's indeed what we need to work on, and that's what we'll do now. So that brings us to the end of this plenary session. We're going to go straight into working sessions. I hope there's coffee outside so we can pick up some on the way. So the working sessions are cut a little short, so we'll start now and then until 12:30. Then you can pick up lunch and go immediately to the special sessions, and then we come back here in plenary at 2:10. So thank you very much, and good luck with rolling up your sleeves and getting some commitments going.